Siobhan Weare works in the law school at Lancaster, and she's the first in the UK to undertake a study into what's called forced penetration cases. So she's been doing a study involving male survivors of sexual violence, and that's what we've been talking to her about.
And she'll explain what forced penetration means in this context.
Siobhan, what are men's experiences of sexual violence?
So my research has focused specifically on men's experiences of female perpetrated sexual violence. And I have conducted the first study in the UK to look at what I call forced to penetrate cases. So these are cases where men are forced to have sex with women without their consent. But I use the term forced to penetrate here because under current UK laws, this is not recognised as rape. So I can't, as a legal academic, I can't use that term because it wouldn't be accurate. So that specifically is what my research has looked at in forced to penetrate cases. And I was, lucky enough to interview 30 men with my wonderful research assistant, Dr. Joanne Hulley. And these men really bravely shared their experiences of being forced to penetrate a woman. And within that, we found that these experiences most frequently happened within the context of an abusive relationship. So 50% of the men that we interviewed reported that it was in the context of other abuse that they were experiencing that this happened. So typically it was one element of the abuse. So there was also financial abuse, coercive control, physical violence, threats, emotional abuse, blackmail, all those other things happening alongside this particular form of sexual violence. So that's what we found in the research most commonly.
So the sexual element is like an additional aspect of a whole range of kind of power relationships. There's a particular kind of power relationship between perpetrator and victim, which spreads across all aspects of life, presumably.
Absolutely, yes. So the men that we spoke to who disclosed that it was part of the abuse they were experiencing actually referred to it as a form of control. So whilst it was, sexual violence, and often those overlaps with physical violence and physical assaults, they were very clear that for them it was the most kind of powerful form of control they experienced, the ultimate form of control over them. So it was very much about that power dynamic, about control, which kind of went throughout the relationship. And this was one aspect of it, and often the worst aspect of the abuse that they experienced.
And of the 30 men you interviewed, Siobhan, what kind of age range did this span across?
So the men, span across the whole age range. There were some men who were older, and this had happened to them when they were much younger. There were other men who were, in their 20s and 30s, who it happened to more recently. So, it happened across the age range. There were men who it happened to in their 40s, in their 50s. It was across the age range. There wasn't, a particular age that it seemed to happen. It seemed to happen across the lifespan.
This is a thing that people don't talk about, isn't it? I mean, you wouldn't know it was happening because there's no mention of it anywhere. So presumably the men aren't talking about it anywhere. There's no context in which this gets acknowledged or admitted to.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It doesn't get talked about, which I think reinforces the challenge that male survivors have coming forward to disclose. So because, we're not discussing this issue, because you don't see it in the press, you don't see it, often you see on dramas, on soaps, on TV, we've seen how powerful certain storylines can be in terms of making people feel they can come forward because similar things might have happened to them. None of that's kind of happened around this particular issue. And so there's very much this kind of silence that exists, and that really makes a barrier for men to come forward and disclose, and that could be to, you know, the authorities, to the police, or to help seek with, you know, support organizations. But it can also be, as you know, I say as simple, but it's never simple to, you know, disclose to friends and family and tell them what's happened. You know, it's very, very difficult.
Well, one of the curious things that we've heard from others looking at the problems men have as victims of abuse is that very often men don't even recognise that it's happening. I don't know how much that affects the population you've dealt with. That men find themselves in an abusive situation, don't even recognise it necessarily as abusive. Maybe by the time they come to you, they do recognise that. But
yeah, I think there was certainly an element of that, and I think that there's several reasons why that's the case, particularly around this form of sexual violence. So I think one of the big challenges is that obviously in order for this form of sexual violence to happen, the men have to be sexually aroused. And so for many of the men, it was very confusing and challenging, distressing and upsetting to try and understand why, when they weren't consenting, they knew they weren't consenting, and they'd made it clear that they weren't consenting, that they were still able to become sexually aroused. So I think that made it very difficult for them to kind of unpick some of the issues around that. I also think that for a lot of the men, because it was kind of the worst or most harmful form of abuse they experienced, a lot of them kind of almost wanted to forget about it or compartmentalize it somewhere else and deal with it later, or not deal with it at all. Or, you know, the men weren't asked about it is the problem, I think. So, you know, when they did access, say, support from a GP because they weren't able to sleep, they had anxiety, they had depression, they were never asked really about the possibility that they were experiencing domestic abuse or sexual abuse. And so they never really got the opportunity to tell their story and kind of explain what happened. And I think that made it very difficult as well, because they weren't given that kind of forum to disclose.
And if they went to the police, what would their attitude be? Were they treated well and properly, or were the police difficult to deal with for them?
So the vast majority of the participants didn't go to the police, right. Perhaps unsurprisingly. Yeah. The few that did, it was largely in the context of the other domestic abuse they'd been experiencing. And on the whole, they had very negative experiences with the police. There was a couple of them who disclosed to the police about their forced to penetrate experiences, specifically within the context of that domestic abuse. But it, you know, was unfortunately overwhelmingly negative, a sense of kind of disbelief, not really getting the right support that they felt that they should get. And then, you know, general issues that I think many victims of crime can understand, things like not being kept up to date with what happened with the case, you know, poor communication from the police. Those things also, you know, that are common with anyone who engages with the police were also brought up. So it, you know, it wasn't, unfortunately, a very positive experience for those men who did engage.
And then thinking about, and you know, this is like the most abusive thing that they experienced. And I'm really interested to think what's the meaning of it to the men to have that experience, to make it the most abusive experience or the most intrusive experience they have had. What is it? What's the meaning of it to men?
So I think it was the magnitude of the impacts that it had on them. So as I mentioned, there was the issue and the confusion and the complexity around this idea of them becoming sexually aroused, which I think a lot of men really struggled, understandably, with. There was also broader issues around, I think it really went for some of them to the heart of what they felt it was to be a man and masculinity, and how it was kind of the ultimate way to feel degraded and dehumanized and to really control them. So it was the one aspect of their life that they might have felt they still had control over themselves, and that control was taken. in order to satisfy the female perpetrator. So I think it was that it really went to the heart of who, of men and masculinity. And I think that's a huge part. Society associates men with sex, positively and negatively. And so I think, men have been socialized that way. And so when something happens that really makes them question what society says about men, how men should be, how men should act, the idea that all men should enjoy all sex all the time. And they didn't, and it was really harmful. And so to try and compute that experience with what they'd been socialized to believe made it very, very difficult for the men, unfortunately.
And how common do you think this is? Because you picked up 30 cases, but do you get the impression that it's more common than
we imagine?
Or how common do you think it is?
It's really difficult to know because we don't have any prevalence data for the UK or for England and Wales or for any kind of part of the UK. In terms of what we do know, in the United States, they have done the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey from 2010. Right. And that's kind of their large-scale national survey they conduct every few years to kind of get a sense of prevalence of sexual and intimate partner violence. And they found that about 1 in 21 of the men who were involved reported that they'd been made to penetrate somebody else during their lifetime. And of those 1 in 21, so that was about 4.8%, 79.2% of them reported that the perpetrator was a woman. So I would suggest that you're looking at a prevalence rate of somewhere, I think, between 3 and 5% based on that study. And there's been smaller scale research studies done in European countries that suggest the prevalence rate of somewhere between 3 and 5%, with the suggestion that the majority of perpetrators are women.
And this is different from men just feeling that they should perform sexually and therefore kind of have sex even though they don't really want it particularly. We're not talking about that.
No. So, as I said, domestic abuse, one form of abuse, that was the most commonly reported, but there was other ways in which this happened. So, things that if you heard that it happened to a woman, you would say you've been raped. But obviously we can't say that. So things like drinks being spiked on a night out and waking up and finding themselves having sex with a woman. There was other men who were blackmailed. So it could be about sexuality. It could be blackmail about intimate relationships. So I'm going to tell your work colleagues, your wife, your children, like everybody and everything that's important in your life about our affair if you do not carry on having sex with me. I'm going to reveal that you are gay if you do not have sex with me. Those sorts of things, also came out. So it wasn't simply, I wasn't in the mood tonight and she made me have sex with her. It was, far more than that. And as I say, most commonly, one form of abuse that was experienced.
Do the men get some kind of help as a consequence? Is there any resource that they can turn to where they can get some kind of deal with the whole range of issues that they're facing? Really, I mean, this domestic abuse, isn't it? Partner abuse. They need some kind of input, presumably.
Yes. No, absolutely. So the men that we spoke with really varied in terms of the help and support they'd accessed. So the first port of call is often, for example, your GP, because if you're struggling with anxiety and depression, you're having nightmares, you're struggling to sleep, you're seeing the impact on your physical and mental well-being. The most common place people tend to go is to their GP. But the problem with going to the GP is if you don't disclose kind of the reasons behind why you're feeling the way you are, if it is because you are experiencing abuse, the GP will typically just deal with the symptoms. So they may prescribe you antidepressants, they may prescribe anti-anxiety medication, etc. They may send you for generic counselling. But what we found where that happened was that actually it kind of was like putting a plaster on a bigger wound, and it really didn't help in the long term. So where the men really felt they should would benefit from support, there was a few men who'd engaged with services that specifically support male survivors of sexual violence. And they found those services invaluable and incredibly helpful. And so,
but they have to find the services, don't they? They have to reach them somehow.
They do. And so what I would say is, number one, if you go onto the Male Survivors Partnership website, there is a list there that's broken down by geographic location, so the Northwest, the Northeast, that lists services that support men. So if there are men who are listening to this who think they would benefit, and they don't have to have experienced this specific form of sexual violence, it could be any form of sexual violence, I would highly recommend going onto the Male Survivors Partnership website and looking at the directory and seeing what services are available near to you. There's also the National Male Survivor Helpline, which is a national helpline that's open Monday to Saturday. You can call and you can access support via that helpline. So, for example, if you want to access a local service, but there's a waiting list, which unfortunately is entirely possible, and you really want help faster, you could call the helpline whilst you're on the waiting list, for example, and get help from them. If you're not ready to speak to someone face to face and to really get into kind of counselling and things, you could call the helpline and they will be able to assist you in the meantime. So there are options, but unfortunately, a lot of the time men aren't aware of these options. And I think part of that is because we don't really talk about men as survivors of sexual violence. And, it's when you see signposting on news stories where we talk about sexual violence, it tends to be to things like rape crisis and women's services. And so I think it is really important that men know that there are services out there for them that they can access.
And if the person they're speaking to doesn't ask, then they probably won't disclose. I mean, as a psychiatrist, I have embarrassing memories of not having asked people about specific issues which turned out to be what they were actually suffering from. But because I didn't ask, they didn't volunteer it. They didn't know what reception they'd get because I wasn't approaching it in that way. So it's about training professionals as well to be aware of this and ask about it. Even if they're not going to provide a specialist service to help, they can refer them on.
Absolutely, yes. So that's been a lot of the work that I've been doing since I've done the research, is engaging with various organisations, so health services, GPs, sexual health providers, but also the police, CPS, different organisations and counselling services as well, to make sure that they are asking this question. And that then if men do feel they can disclose, that these services and organisations and individuals are not shocked and they don't react inappropriately. Because I think if you're not aware of it, sometimes people will kind of, I don't think necessarily shocked, but sometimes people are quite disbelieving, or that doesn't happen, or that can't happen. And that's not the reaction that these men need when they disclose. So they need to be engaging with professionals who have at least a very basic knowledge of the issue. And then, like you said, are able to go on to signpost to the right organisations. But of course, it is in how you ask the question, and that is so important. And it's really important to make men feel like they are in a safe, non-judgmental space when these sorts of questions are asked, because it is incredibly private and incredibly personal thing to disclose. And so I think that is, the way in which the question's asked and by whom is just as important in asking the question.
Well, that's true, but I know my experience from training doctors and medical students is that on the whole they're afraid to ask because they think the person will be insulted if the answer is no. There's lots of questions which people should ask, but they refrain from asking, like, alcohol consumption, drug consumption.
Weight, I expect, as well.
Well, weight's one, isn't it?
Yeah.
And people, I think doctors and probably many people are afraid to ask because they think they'll insult the person or get a bad response. People have to overcome that and be matter-of-fact and serious in their inquiry. So better ask badly than not ask at all.
Absolutely. But also, it's entirely possible that you may have a man who is telling you that he's experiencing physical abuse,
Yeah,
or
yeah, yeah,
that, making comments that his partner's controlling his finances,
yeah.
or, his self-esteem is really taking a hit because his partner's being quite abusive in what she's saying about him. They're opening up a conversation by disclosing to
Yeah.
you. And I think the mistake that can be made is that the questions go so far and they never
Yeah,
go as far as to
yeah,
ask about the sexual
yeah,
side of potential abuse. So the doctor or the GP or the police may then ask, have a conversation and kind of discuss a bit about, is there physical abuse? Is there coercive control? Tell me a bit more about the financial abuse, but then they never ask that kind of final question. And I think
yeah,
if someone's beginning to open up to you, it's
yeah.
important to remember to ask that final question, because
Yes,
there's a reason why they're opening up.
yes. We Jill and I spent a long time assessing families where children were likely to be removed by the local authority into long-term adoption foster care, and the staff we had doing the assessment very often just balked at noticing the things that were the most awful that needed to be recorded. They kind of left the room at the moment when the child was tossed across onto a piece of furniture or something. So people are afraid
People
to
are
ask
nervous,
and
yeah.
afraid to confront the awfulness of people's experience. And people need to be brave to open it up and allow that to come out.
What's it like for them, Siobhan, thinking about new relationships? What impact does it have on what they think about women?
So it did vary, but on the whole, I would say that there was big trust issues, particularly where it had formed part of an abusive, a broader abusive relationship. So some of the men really struggled to have, future intimate relationships, to trust women, to trust anyone in many ways. That wasn't always the case. There was some men who had gone on and got married and had children, as an example, and were in new relationships and had told their new partner, their new wife, all about what happened in their past. And, they really credited those women of helping them through the trauma
Yeah.
of their past. So, it really wasn't that, we didn't get a sense that any of the men hated women, or blamed all women or anything like that for kind of what happened. And actually what was very interesting was, I think a lot of the men really struggled with how to talk about what happened to them. And I think part of that was because they really didn't want to impede upon the experiences of women. They were acutely aware of how, women experience sexual violence and sexual aggression on a daily basis, ranging straight through from being wolf whistled and catcalled and, sexually assaulted, through to, rape and things like that. And so they really didn't want to occupy in a negative way the space that women have created.
It's
To be able to
not a
speak
competition, is there? It's not a
Absolutely not.
like we're
Yeah.
bigger victims than you are kind of thing.
No, and I think that made it very difficult for the men to know how to frame what happened to them and how to talk about what happened to them. But they were all really aware that what happened wasn't rape. Like, they had all gone away and researched the law, and they knew the law said it wasn't rape, but they didn't know what it was. So then that made it even harder to have this language to really
Yeah.
talk about what happened. So
Do these cases ever get to court? Does anybody ever have to argue these issues in court? Have any of your subjects had that experience?
So none of the men that we interviewed had specifically had their forced to penetrate experiences dealt with in court. Some of them had been in court for different reasons, so for other aspects of the abuse they'd experienced, or they'd been engaged with the family court system in relation to, for example, accessing children following the breakdown of relationships. But none of them had specifically had criminal case brought in relation to their forced to penetrate experience.
So the women weren't on the sex offenders register then. That wasn't going to happen.
No.
And what about perpetrator programs? I mean, we're learning that there are very few of those for women. If they,
Yeah, That's true. There are very few perpetrator programs specifically for women, and that was a concern for a couple of the participants. So, a couple of them were really concerned that essentially the perpetrator hasn't engaged with the perpetrator program because they haven't been convicted, they haven't been engaged with the criminal justice system. And so then there was the fear that what will they go on and do? Where the perpetrator had been convicted of other offences in relation to that the male victim. So, for example, grievous bodily harm or things like that. The sexual side of the abuse hadn't been charged and hadn't been prosecuted, and therefore that's obviously when they were in prison, for example, they were not engaging within those programs. So that was a concern for some of the participants.
And was that because they were never deemed, the CPS didn't charge, or was it because they didn't ever really tell the criminal justice system about that aspect of the problem that they had?
So a couple of the men did disclose to the police that specific aspect.
Yeah.
And their cases weren't taken any further. And several of the men didn't disclose to the police that specific aspect. Again, they weren't asked. So, and also for some of them, as I say, it really took them time to be able to come to terms with that specific aspect of the abuse. And for some of them, it wasn't in many ways an immediate priority in their life to deal with it. So some of them ended up homeless because they left the family home because of the abuse they were experiencing. So priority would be to find somewhere safe to sleep. And, some of them had serious physical injuries. So the priority is to get yourself physically well again. Some of them weren't, able to see their children. So the priority was to get access to their children. So the sexual violence often fell down the list of priorities. And that, I think, kind of meant that they boxed it off for a period of time, or tried to, in order to deal with those immediate priorities. But it often meant that, they weren't disclosing to police or to other services. But when they tried, they generally didn't have positive outcomes.
Of course, that would have an effect on the level of risk that the women were perceived to have, wouldn't it? If they didn't have that level of issue within the risk assessment.
Well, I was going to ask whether you got the impression that some women were serial perpetrators, whether they had histories. So I don't know if you heard that any of the women the men were involved in had been in same kind of relationships before. So
there wasn't really a sense of that came out of the interviews. Certainly the men themselves had often experienced repeat victimization. So that could be from different women. It didn't have to always be in the context of being forced to penetrate specifically, but they may have experienced abuse from other women, other types of sexual abuse or domestic abuse. Some of them had been abused as children by both men and women. Right. So there was a sense of, kind of repeat victimization across the lifespan. But there wasn't necessarily a sense that it was, there was serial women offenders or anything like that that came out of the interviews.
No, it's more like a serial victim in some cases, due to their childhood experience, really, setting them up as harmed from those childhood experiences.
And that's, we know, for example, when we look at women who are victims in adulthood, that they may possibly have been victims in childhood as well, especially when we're thinking about abuse within relationships or within families. So it shouldn't be too much of a surprise to hear that the same thing happens to men. But I think we don't necessarily really think about men that way. And so I think for some people, it can be more shocking to think that men could be repeatedly victimized across their lifetime.
Yes. Where's your research heading, Siobhan? Where are you taking it?
So at the moment, I'm continuing to try and do training and kind of public engagement, what we call knowledge exchange, with professionals who may engage with these men, to really make sure that we're maximising the knowledge that's come from this research, so that hopefully if other men do come forward to these individuals or organizations, they can have a more positive experience than the men that we spoke to. I think ultimately there's issues around the law in this area that need to be addressed. And so, hopefully at some point there may be opportunities to look at law reform in relation to how the law deals with this particular sort of sexual offending. And then I'm also kind of very interested in looking at, even if there was law reform, how would you successfully prosecute these sorts of cases, thinking about jury trials and jurors, myths and stereotypes that play a huge role in sex offending cases. Yeah. But obviously there's a particular issue here around these sorts of cases.
Wow.
Siobhan, I think we have to thank you for this really concentrated account of what's happened. I mean, concentrated in the sense there's a lot of information here and a lot of interesting stuff to explore further.
I think a lot of people will be shocked as well by what they're hearing, Siobhan, actually, and it's good to make people aware of this, I'm sure.
So
yeah, I hopefully, I mean, I hope that, even if it pricks the interest of, some professionals who want to know more, or members of the public who, just feel a bit more educated, or men who might have experienced this and they know, well, actually, I'm not alone.
Yes.
At least 30 other men have, experienced this. And, since the research has come out, I've had many men contact me and tell me about their experiences and, thank the men who participated and thanked us for doing the research. So really, they're not alone. It's not just them that it's happened to. There are other men who have experienced it as well.
You're not alone. Very important message.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. A very interesting talk. Thank you.